Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you tonight. My name is Desrosiers, and I'm the Director of Artist Program at the Lunder Institute for American Art. It is with great joy and excitement that we are launching tonight the Lunder Institute Talks, a series of hour-long live conversation led by the Institute area directors. As you can imagine, given the current context, it felt essential for my colleague and myself to remain connected with our audience, share the work that we do and that we keep on doing, the question that we aim to address, and most importantly, support the voice of scholar, artists, and creative collaborator who are shaping the field of American art. One of whom is tonight's guest, Naeem Mohaiemen, who is a senior fellow at the Institute this year, as well as the inaugural recipient of the Osorio Grant, which provide generous support to an artist in the making of a new work while at the Institute. But before we dive into our conversation, I want to share a friendly reminder that we will leave 20 minutes at the end for question asked by the audience, by you. We will bring you to the screen and you'll have a virtual face-to-face with the artist to ask your question. In preparation for this segment, you are invited to drop your question in the Q&A chat located at the bottom of your Zoom window. When you are ready for questions, we will call your name. You will be invited onto the screen to ask your question to Naeem directly. Please note that you are invited to send your question as they spark during this conversation, at any point during this conversation. And without further preamble, I'm delighted to welcome Naeem to join us. Good evening. Hi. I want to start by thanking you for the privilege of this time together. We are so excited to be launching this series with you. And to give a bit of context to the audience as per this conversation, I'll just walk us through where we are at in your fellowship. So you have begun research for a new project you'll develop as part of this affiliation with us at the Institute. It is done in collaboration with a student researcher at Colby, Sam Scott, and several of our faculty members. Of course, given the constraint of travel between New York and Maine, two states with very different demographic and experience in the pandemic, we are finding new ways to do collaborative and collective research. One, as we were discussing the preparation for this conversation, one element that presented itself as a compelling point of departure to understand collective work, and I'm so glad you brought this up, Naeem, was to consider, in light of the current moment, the ways in which your practice has been shaped by the histories of artist collective, such as group material, for example, and in particular, their focus on twin crises in the Reagan 80s, so the aid crisis and the US intervention in Latin America. And to give a bit of a backstory, and I'm paraphrasing here Doug Ashford here, who's one of the members of Group Material. Group Material is a well-known artist collective that was funded in 1979 as a countermeasure to the gallery system and the oppressiveness of systems of state power at the time. It aimed to create art that would be a dynamic contribution to urban and cultural production. Group Material activated ambitious collaborative contexts of encounter to challenge a much more diverse vision of culture. And they were quite vocal and very active during the aid crisis, if I may add. And so understanding that self-organizing into collective is very often a response to moment of crises and political instability. Historically speaking, the collective as a format seems to generate a space for critical thinking, collective action, and challenging cultural production, right? It is exploring what art can be as a political tool in public spaces, basically. Naeem, you yourself were part of Visible Collective, a collective that took shape after 9/11 And as such, we both agreed that this could be an interesting way to think about the need for collectiveness as a mode of response. But more specifically to your practice, we would love to hear more about your work has been informed by collective practices as an active methodology, I would say, to rethink the role of the artist, agency in public spaces, and cultural policies. Maybe we could start and you could walk us through the origin story of Visible Collective and what you were reacting to. And maybe you'd want to share some visual as well.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to share some visuals. Let me just share my screen.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is appearing all right? Is an image from Liverpool.
Yeah.
So lots to talk about, a lot of things to get into. I might forget some of the things at the beginning, but hopefully they'll come up during the Q&A.
Yeah.
I guess the first thing to just mention is you mentioned group material. It's a really interesting collective for us to be in dialogue with because in many ways they came as a critique from inside the art world. You know, there were people who were active practicing artists, had gone to art school, had been part of the discourse. And then had been turned off by many things happening and wanted to do something that would break the idea of the white cube and the elite gallery. And our position was very different. We didn't come from inside the art world at all. Of all our collective members, we formed informally in 2002. And then had a proper show 2004, 2005. That was the first time. Only Ibrahim Qureshi had gone to art school. I think everybody else had come through somewhere else. And we were doing political organizing around the condition of Muslim migrants after 9/11. And the museum just happened to appear as another place to do our work. We didn't think of it as a destination. And so when I started learning about group materials work and started being in dialogue with Doug, I was also struck by the difference between a collective formed in the Reagan 1980s by people who were working artists, had gone to art school and had been part of a particular discourse. And we, post-2000, you know, the Bush 2000s, the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. And the other important thing that I just want to say up front is, as far as I know, every member of group material was a US citizen. And not, I think Felix Gonzalez Torres was the one person of color in the group, as far as I know. We were mostly immigrants and with various legal situations as well, which made it more difficult for us to speak as well. So I'll get into some of that. I wanted to show a few slides just to give a sense of Visible Collective, because we started in 2002. Our last project in the US was 2007. We then still had a few more European exhibitions, but we by then already started questioning the project. So there isn't anything actively produced since 2008. You know, and a lot of it lived on the internet. So I'm just going to show some slides just to give a quick overview. The context was that we were all working quite specifically about the situation inside the US. We were involved in anti-war organizing, but primarily our focus was the condition of migrants, the policing, the surveillance, you know, all of which today, if I say it, people instantly understand what I'm saying. But in 2002, 2003, there's a lot more skepticism about the idea that the state could be spying on you. So this is a still shot from a video that I'll show a short clip of in a minute, but it also exhibits the phenomenon of patriotism that you take on as a defense mechanism. So this is an Indian store in Jackson Heights, Queens. And at that time, suddenly American flags started appearing in every shop window, which was some sort of sign also of don't attack our shop because we are patriotic Americans. The fact that every immigrant felt the need to project that out loud was part of the dynamics that were already being created at that time. This is a somewhat messy slide of some of our collective members. Anandarup Roy on the top, then Tore Fox, Anjali Malhotra, Shahed Amanullah with actually Chaplain James Yee in the middle row, who was detained. He was a Muslim chaplain. A group of us in the middle, Seban Zaidi on the right. Ibrahim Qureshi, who I said was one person who had come completely inside art discourse. Christopher Dan Bergman, and then one of our curators on the right holding up our hand as we're trying to decide if we'll use the window, which is Jayashree Abichandani. I'll get more into the collective members later, where they came from and what they're doing, because what they're doing is also of a great deal of interest. But these are all taken around 2002, 2003. And we were terrible at documenting. We didn't think we needed to document ourselves. So when I went looking for pictures, I realized we really didn't stop to take pictures of ourselves.
No, you're retrieving archive.
Yeah, archives, yeah.
introduction.
And then,
How many
and then I
minutes?
went, yeah, and then I went looking for pictures of group material. And if you search for them, the most common photograph that comes up is of the cast of the television series Dynasty. I think they were doing it as sort of a hack. They would just sometimes give that as, it appeared in some magazines as their photograph. But this is a cover of one of their books. And this, I think, is how I first introduced you to their work, Daisy. This is a conversation that Doug and I had done, where we specifically talked about the idea of collectives and atomized time. I consider atomized time the time we are in now, where everyone is separate, right? Where there's no such thing as viewing things together anymore. Everyone is with their love, which is the device. As compared to the 1980s, when a lot of what group material was doing was physically on the street. So we talked about this in this conversation. We also talked about the fact that even something that's supposed to be a radical, outsider, resistant move, such as forming a collective, could become commercialized by an art market that has kind of figured out how to commercialize anything. So what do we do with that if you've done a resistant figure, but suddenly the system invites you in? We talked about that as well.
And that was a big impulse with group material, which Doug was a founder of.
Yeah. Group material definitely wanted to hack into that. We hadn't come from that place. We came from the place of like, we're organizing rallies in front of INS office. It was called Immigration Nationalization Services back then. It hadn't fully become Homeland Security yet. So we're organizing in front of that. We're organizing in Jackson Heights. We're sometimes organizing in front of a mosque as a organizing place. So the museum can be yet another place to organize. We just thought it was going to be a place where we would do one exhibition and leave. And then it took a life of its own as well. I'm going to show a very short clip. I'm going to show 2 clips just to give a sense of what we were doing. The sound is low and it might be a little hard to hear, and I'll explain also why. This is a 9-minute video. I'll just show a minute and a half, which was an interview with a Pakistani man who was a dentist by profession in Staten Island, but who had been arrested in 2002, very common in those days because his neighbors complained about him. So this is like some sort of East German model where neighbor complains on neighbor, and his neighbors basically said that he brings chemicals in. Well, he brought chemicals in because he was a dentist, but he was arrested. He was in detention for almost 6 months, and then we interviewed him afterwards. But he was still so afraid that he wouldn't be on camera. So the entire interview was done in a car. We kept driving and filming. So you can hear the hum of the sound. But I hope you can hear a little bit of the dialogue. Here he's sort of finished talking about his experience in detention and talking about how he's trying to build his life afterwards.
So even though most of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, you only saw 6 or 7 Saudis in prison.
6 or 7 Saudis, yes.
Most of the people in there were Pakistani,
Bangladeshi, and some of Indian, Egyptian, Jordanian.
You said you're fighting the case to clear your name, but let's say it gets cleared. Let's say everything is okay. Do you like life here? Do you just somewhere you want to be?
Do I like life here? Life in this sense, yes, you have some freedom. And when I was Pakistan, never seen freedom like that, because reason is army. So you can go and, yes, in America, you can go and knock the door, yes. Sooner or later, they're going to listen, but not that kind of condition. So that's why I feel, for me, was little life easier here than in Pakistan.
So if everything works out,
If
everything works, just stay here.
I'll stay here, that I'm not sure right now. Yes, I feel, yes, I have nothing. I'm completely gone. But then after next moment I say, okay, let's try again. So, still surviving.
So the flag was everywhere that year. The flag you see through what looks like a veil is actually shot from the window of a friend who's a French artist who was doing a residency. And I remember one day she said, what is with the American obsession with flags? And I said, what do you mean? And then I went to her studio, and this massive billboard glitter, it keeps changing. So I just started filming flags everywhere I would go. So I realized that the second half of this film was shot in 2004 because you can already see the signs of the election preparation. And I'm pretty sure, even though it's hard to remember 16 years ago, but I'm pretty sure that 2004, even while we were working on this, we were walking around with the confidence that Bush was going to not get re-elected, because how could he get re-elected after starting 2 wars? But it also gives you a little shiver when you see that billboard, because the whole thing about people not voting and turnout was there in 2004, and obviously we're entering another election seasons where turnout, manipulated or not, will be there.
Yeah.
I just want to show this very quickly, just to say the sort of, we talked about the 4 axes of media coverage of Islam and Muslims after 9/11. I won't get into the details here. This is actually a slide from back then when we used to present. I even kept the old font from 2006. But we talked about the sort of 4 axes. One was, of course, the obsession with the veil and what it meant about Islam and Muslims and Muslim countries and the idea of liberation. So I'll just mention that on the far right is Laura Bush, wearing a veil on a visit to the Middle East. Then the second thing was really a demographic fear that the Muslims are having too many children and they're going to overtake our country's original population. That fear was stronger in Europe, of course, because of the number dynamics there as opposed to the United States. So a lot of these images were actually from Europe. So even though we were talking about America, even though the Visible Collective project was actually called Disappeared in America, we were constantly reminded that parallel things were going on in Europe, sometimes in even sharper ways, right? So the whole discourse in France about whether France is losing its French identity, the Mona Lisa and hijab, Denmark, etc. Then the third axis is very much about the idea of spying on your neighbors, so your mysterious neighbors. A series of images from that time, the cover of the New Yorker, The Siege, which is a film I both protested and then went inside and saw, and then thought, oh, it's maybe not so bad because it's a little nuanced. Michelle Malkin, she's a particular bugbear of mine because she went to my college. So Oberlin, where I went, is a very progressive school, but people like that have also graduated from here and become stars of the neocon press. And then finally, the idea of the Borg hive mind, that Muslims think collectively, and therefore books like this, including Islam for Dummies, will help understand what they're about. This was actually a series of books that were given to GIs to read before they went to Iraq, so that they could understand what they were facing. So I'm going to show another short video clip. Each film in the series actually tried to touch on another aspect of what was happening after 9/11. The dentist who gets informed on by his neighbors is very much, it's local, it could happen anywhere. But the other aspect, of course, is flying, which became sort of a security zone. And this is a film called Fear of Flying. It's a riff on the Erika Jong book, but of course, it's nothing like that book. It's about, again, a Pakistani man who was placed on the no-fly list. But also what was interesting is the Pakistani man who had considered himself very American and then suddenly faced the limits of what being American meant. How American he felt didn't have anything to do with how people might see him. And you see him talking about that a little bit.
Happy-go-lucky Hussein's family drives into Newark Airport. We just get in line to check in. Omar, myself, Abraham, my wife Evelyn. I have my Hawaiian short sleeve floral shirt and the all-American vacation mood. We get to the check-in counter just to check in. It took a little longer. So I asked the girl that what is happening, and she said that you are on a special list, yourself and your son. Yourself and Omar, these 2 passengers are on a special list, so try to get clearance for you guys. We asked the girl to be more specific about it and more precise about it. What kind of list is she talking about? She said basically it's called a no-fly list. I don't know exactly what transpired. Whom did she call? Whom she had to call? I learned later on, after my trip back to incidents like that, they are supposed to call the local authorities or federal authorities. What made me impatient was, and a little disturbed, was the passengers behind us, who noticed that it was taking a little longer than usual for this particular family to be checked in. The whispering and murmuring and mumbling, they knew exactly what was going on. That because we were talking fairly loud to the attendant. So when we were giving the boarding card, all these passengers looked at us and must have thought that, geez, should we take this plane or not? I would have thought the same too.
He then goes on to say how if he had lived in Pakistan, he might be the person deciding about the fate of other minorities as well. So interesting figure. He had enough of a view of his own complicated situation as someone who was a minority in America, but not a minority in Pakistan.
Yeah. And the complexity of that position. Yeah.
I'll just quickly show a few more works very quickly. This one leads from the no-fly list because back then, pre-2001, the whole phenomenon of black drivers being stopped, African-American drivers being stopped for random quote-unquote searches was very much in the press. So driving while black became a phrase. And so we did this work called Driving While Black becomes Flying While Brown, where we talked about the fact that the single largest group of American Muslims are actually African-American, but they were not part of the discourse because you couldn't come up with a solution of putting up borders and having tighter security checks, because suddenly you face a population that you'd be very, there's no way for you to deny their Americanness at least. And these are actually images of a quote-unquote terror cell that was arrested, but in Oregon, and the only cell that was all African-American, which was also a bit strange because that wasn't typically who was getting arrested. It's more complex. I'm just simplifying just to...
Yeah. We're going through.
Yeah, for the sake of time, Then this is another project we did where we're collecting the names of people arrested in the first 1 year and figuring out what their age was, what city they were in. But the piece was called Nahnu Wahad, but really are we one? Because one of the things we wanted to talk about is that the experience of being detained would create this false unity between everyone who considered themselves Muslim or from a Muslim country. But the unity itself was very temporary, and class would of course intervene so that the, MIT educated Iranian engineer or Bangladeshi scientist might be okay while the taxi driver won't be. And we were interested in that even the position of being surveilled was not equal for everybody.
No, that there was a hierarchy within it.
Yeah, there was a hierarchy within, and we were, I'll talk about that also hopefully, then the hierarchy of us. Like the reason we were able to make the work is because we had some safety. And where did that safety come from? It can be one, immigration status, and two can be class position, of course. This is a close-up of the same work. And then this is just how it would appear in the physical Queen's Museum where the whole premiered. And, you had to clear the rights to names and the stories. And we found that children are the ones who like to touch things the most, and adults often say, I shouldn't touch it. And then that's another piece called Casual Fresh American Style. We would do a lot of riffs. So this was actually the name of a Gap jeans campaign with Sarah Jessica Parker from Sex and the City. And it was all over the city at that time, this Casual Fresh American Style, very united colors of Benetton, somewhat multiracial, but carefully selected image of the American family. And so we did a project that was kind of a response to it. And these were all people who had been detained at various times or were members of somebody who had been detained. And this is at the Queen's Museum where the project first appeared.
Beautiful.
And that was another variation. We called it American Gothic. This was down in Texas at Project Row House. And then a project we did called When an Interpreter Could Not Be Building Timelines, which I guess is one similarity with group material as well, because they did the AIDS timeline and they did sort of chronological things about Latin American intervention. And so we wanted to continuously build timeline of things happening 2001 onwards. And we wanted to get away from the sort of really famous cases and go to sort of strange things like Cat Stevens, the muse, deplaned, pulled off a plane once, but it was kind of forgotten. And we were interested in those strange outlier stories. And we also wanted to specifically talk about people who were willing to do alliances across their communities. So the Japanese American community wasn't targeted after 2000, but they were, of course, targeted after World War II. So Fred Korematsu was somebody who did a lot of work on behalf of Muslim migrants at that time. So we're interested in that crossing over. This is how the work looks when it's installed in a window. We looked at what was happening elsewhere. So while America was doing everything, other countries were, and often it would have the American name. So this new law that was passed in Japan was called Japan's Patriot Act. So it's like a franchising of American laws overseas. And of course, France was on fire, and Nicolas Sarkozy, who thank God is not anymore, but a horrendous person. And I was always struck by the fact that, they're socializing and surveillance and policing everywhere. But what you could get away with saying was also different in different places. And I did feel sometimes see things coming out in the European press, where in the American press, it had been, there was a way that it was clouded. It was
Yeah,
wrapped in some sort of civility.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's before the rise of talk radio and all of that. So talk radios made a lot of this kind of language totally acceptable here in the US as well. Or maybe, to be honest, it was always acceptable. It just didn't, it wouldn't come out of the White House. It would come out from other places. And then that is how it looks when it's installed.
Mm.
And this is in California. It's a series of works. We install all the films together. I'll stop there. I do have some slides I want to show regarding Visible Collective itself, but maybe, pause and give you the chance also, Daisy, to sort of, I went through a lot of material very quickly, so perhaps you can get me back on track in terms of things that audience would like to know also about at this point.
Well, maybe as you're introducing us to the collective, it could be interesting to be more specific about how many members were part of Visible Collective, and also their background. It was my understanding, as you mentioned, that they were coming from different fields, and so it could give us back information that we carry with us as you keep sharing the work that you guys have done together.
Sure.
And how you met, how this coming together took place.
Yeah, I actually, I was trying before today's presentation to actually map where everyone is today. I got sort of halfway there. It's the middle of the workday, so you email someone and they're sort of like,
doing their things.
They're doing their thing. But I'll show you something. I mean, I think the idea of an accidental collective very much occurs to me now as I look through it. The kernel was, as I mentioned, Ibrahim Qureshi was the one person who was a working artist and who had experience of even having museum shows and applying for just the way it works. And he and I were the initial nucleus. We together wanted to submit an application, which was just two of us. And it started getting larger and larger, and we wanted to do more. It almost, it's hard to explain this exactly now, but in 2004, you definitely had this sense that nobody else was talking about it, because not too many people were talking about it. I think I still remember the first time the New York Times ran an op-ed actually kind of starting to denounce Guantanamo Abu Ghraib detentions. This is before the photos come out. Once the photos come out, then everybody, of course, starts, but before that. And I wish I could remember what day, but I just remember I remember having this sense that it was the first time I saw that in the New York Times. So it was that rare, right? General American media, there was this thing of like something horrendous has happened. So whatever is happening afterwards is justified. So just like people also accepted that silence was patriotic and, questioning was unacceptable. And then of course the tide turned, but in 2004, it hadn't turned yet. And so that's why we approached the museum as, maybe we can do it here because we sure can't get published in a newspaper. And we kept gathering more people. And finally we said, okay, we can't have on the museum names of 12 people, or 14 at some point. And so then we just came up with the name Visible Collective. And I've said before that if we thought the collective was going to keep doing more exhibitions and projects, we might have come up with a different name because it's quite literal. The migrants are invisible except when they're hyper visible as police mugshots or terrorism news stories. So let's make them visible in a different way. So it's very, very sort of one-to-one. So that's how we collected. But I think definitely not people who had done projects in museums before. I myself, everything I did was in film festivals, especially human rights film festivals. That's where I would show, which is a completely different universe. And the human rights film festivals, as opposed to the first time I was in a museum show, sense that in the museum, there were a whole lot of people that just nowhere in our context that wouldn't have seen the work otherwise. Whether they sit and watch the whole thing is a different question, because everybody who comes to the film festival, if they bought a ticket, they are invested in watching it all the way through. So you might get people just walking in and out, and any filmmaker will say it's heartbreaking when people walk through a looped film, right? Because it's not necessarily designed for that sit-down experience. But we definitely had the sense there was a completely different audience. So you asked about the background, so let me share a chart. It's actually an old slide, again, that we had done actually even back then. And I'll tell you why we did this. It's a little hard to see everybody because it's like tiny little images. But what it essentially does is on the left is where they were born. The color coding gives you their immigration status. It's kind of strange to have used green all the way through, but basically the light green was people who had green cards. The middle green was people who were US citizen but had been naturalized, because there was that whole discourse that if you're naturalized but were not born, you could be denaturalized. There's a process. And on the top were people who were born here in the US and were citizens. We used to say, okay, you're the group that's bulletproof, right? So at the top is actually Ibrahim Qureshi, and at the bottom of the citizen group is Aymara Lynn with the microphone. And then everything else in the red is all the other immigration statuses you can have, right? Visa, processing papers, out of status and undocumented. And one of the reasons we did this is because we would show the project and there would be 3 or 4 of us there talking. And there was a way that people would take the crisis and project it onto our bodies. Yeah. Because we are sitting there, there's a feeling of, well, things are okay because look, the spokespeople from the community have come forward. And I was very aware of our class. I mean, we all were very aware of our class privilege. So we said, look, we are not in the same situation. That's why we did the chart to say, these are not the people in the danger zone, because people with green cards aren't necessarily getting arrested. It's immigration as the wedge for surveillance. So we did that. And then I just did this today. I was just trying to figure out where everyone was. So this is just very quick, but just to tell you 14 years later where people are, which will give you a sense of what they were doing before as well.
Yeah, of course. And how the time has brought them in different directions. Yeah. So
Ibrahim Qureshi is still a working artist. He's based in Amsterdam, mostly exhibits in Europe, has not shown in I think soon after this, 2007, 2008, he moved to Amsterdam and then he just was in Europe the whole time. And that's from his website. Donna Golden is a film editor. She works on various documentary projects. Uzma Rizvi is an archaeologist. She might have already finished by then, I'm not sure, might have been in the final stages of graduate school. Tore Folks is a photographer. Anandarup Roy is a cartographer. He does cartography projects involving interactive maps. Jianha is an artist and makes jewelry. That's one of her designs. Anjana Malhotra is a lawyer. I think she finished with being a lawyer then, but now she's a senior lawyer. Most recently, she was involved in this case against Buffalo, this Black Lives Matter court case against the Buffalo Police Department. She was the main lawyer on that. Christopher Dan Bergman is a photographer, as he was then. He's a documentary photographer and does stylized studio photography as well. Seban Zaidi is still a filmmaker, but not in New York anymore. Was in Chicago and might have moved now. He also went back to Pakistan for some time and then came back. Anjali Malhotra is a lawyer at Netflix. That's my favorite. Yeah. Vivek Bald was a DJ and a musician, and then soon after Visible Collective went to grad school, came out, and this is his dissertation about South Asian migrants in the early 1900s, married into African American and Latino families, and formed this new American subjectivities, crossed the color line in different ways back then. And he's working on his second book right now. He's also working on a film based on this.
Oh, wow.
Great book, highly recommended.
Yes.
And he's a professor at MIT.
Duly noted.
Aziz Haq is our other lawyer. He was a lawyer back then. He also clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think he clerked for her at the same time as Visible Collective, 2003. He was sort of our, he would give us the legal analysis, and his legal analysis was a level far higher than what we actually needed to make our artwork. Sometimes we would just say, is this legal? Is this accurate? And he would, of course, say, well, it's not a yes/no answer, and then give a 10-minute answer. Then I would think, okay, but was that a yes or no? But he's written 2 books, one during the Bush administration called Unchecked and Unbalanced, and one most recently called How to Save Constitutional Democracy. And he was one of the lead lawyers on the case filed against the Muslim travel ban when the Trump administration came into office. So, everybody's work is somehow connected, but I guess his and Anjana's can be said to be directly connected to what we were doing 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And Aymara Lynn has actually just finished getting her law certification. She was just telling me that she just went through the process this week. So she's also going to be a human rights lawyer here in New York. And she's also an artist, and she made this to share with the group. She just did this for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Yeah. So that's sort of a very quick, where are they now? I've missed two people who I wasn't able to get in touch with, and I wanted to have the right image. But you get a sense that people went into many different directions.
And came from many directions, but that there's this common goal and reflecting on the present time. And it seems finding strategies to remember and create opportunity, or put mechanism in place so that we are witness together. We are accountable to this time together.
I think the other thing, just to mention about us as a collective, and I've thought a lot about the juxtaposition between us and Group Material. Group Material is a quintessentially New York art collective. They came out of that scene in the 1980s. They were invested in overturning the big white cubes of that time and creating their own spaces, downtown, etc. We were, of course, all in New York, but we were activists and organizers in New York, and first of all, not so Manhattan focused, much more in Queens and Brooklyn, which is why it makes sense that the first exhibition was at Queens Museum, because that was in our space. And as I mentioned, not necessarily thinking that this is going to go on for a long time, but it kept going. The other thing to mention, after time, spoke about this with Doug as well, because Group Material started getting invited to Europe as well. We started getting invited to Europe. So often typically come from Scandinavian countries or Germany, that had the sort of funding that maybe an interest, maybe places that had education departments very tightly integrated with curatorial. I'm talking 2005, 6. And so we would go there and all a new work there. And that created a lot of questioning inside the group, because it's a lot of effort to recreate, let's say, even that installation with the names and the rice and all that in another country. And one of the things we said as well, but we were trying to critique what was happening in America. What exactly is happening doing it in Finland, in Helsinki? How is that going to translate? And it also it sometimes felt a little bit, and we were quite critical of ourselves and what we were going through. It sometimes felt like we were being imported, because that museum in that city hadn't figured out how to reach non-white communities in their city. That tendency is still there, but I think it's miles better now. But we really experienced that. We thought, are we a corrective to a problem they haven't been able to solve here?
Exactly.
I remember there was one German a museum that had one of those multi-use things where in the daytime it's a museum, in the evening it gives over to a little club. And in the daytime we were there, we were presenting, and there were no really non-white audiences there. In the evening, because we stayed and the club kind of thing happened, then suddenly there were all these German, Turkish young people, who their first language is German, but also somewhat Turkish identified, and they were all there. And I remember thinking, why wasn't the museum able to get these people out in the morning? And we felt that we were almost, we were possibly covering up a gap. The inability to communicate or reach out to local communities was filled in by having these hyphenated Americans fly over and install something at great expense to even bring two people over, right? And we also started, we internally started really being in question about what are we doing in Europe? So that was another thing I think that started, the group didn't come apart as if like we didn't want to work together. It was more that people started prioritizing, okay, I need to do something else. Like if you just look at what some of the lawyers have done, and maybe it's a little bit of, maybe it's not quite fair to just focus on the lawyers, because everybody, the photographers, everybody's having an impact. Everybody's having an impact, but maybe with the lawyers it's a little easier to figure out because they're fighting court cases, which can't happen somewhere else, right? I guess the photographer could show their photograph somewhere else as well. So I think people just decided that their energy needed to be focused in getting specific things done inside the US. Right? Still at least some of our members who still had some, Aziz certainly, and Amjad has faith in the law, like going through the procedure, slow as it is.
Yeah. I'll ask one question and then we'll open to the audience because we're already there. But I want to make sure I ask this one because as we're reflecting on collective action by artists and other collaborator, one of the questions that I'm sure came to mind many times, and as you're describing in different locations, is how is this action? What is this action going to do? Like the outcomes and the intent and what make a gesture or proposal efficient in one way, and how do we qualify this efficiency or this effectiveness? And this question becomes more acute when the work travel across borders. So can you share some thoughts about artist intents when it comes from a group? How do you reach consensus, or how do you nurture the social experiment that it can be in productive way?
I'm laughing because I don't know if we ever got to consensus. We just muddled along until we're like, okay, I guess this is the way we're doing it because there's no strong objection. I have to say another collective I belonged to more recently called Gulf Labor, which is not a collective that makes work, but that was a collective specifically focused on targeting the Guggenheim Museum and any other museum and their practices in regarding labor hired to build their museums in the Middle East. That was much more looking at the conditions of the display rather than the work itself. That one had a much more iterative collective process where we discussed until we had full consensus. Visible Collective was more just sort of like, okay, here's an idea, we kind of go back and forth a little bit, and then it's sort of like whoever wants to put in the work, right? Whoever actually wants to do the labor ends up sort of prevailing. But there was never, the only thing we really strongly disagreed about sometimes was how much risk we were going to take. Right? Yeah. What are the things that we can't? So we were very careful actually to not talk about, we made one work about Abu Ghraib, but generally we were careful about detention policy because we so many people who are not citizens, we wondered if that was going to result in prosecution because you didn't know what the parameters of prosecution actually were. And we would both be disturbed to be afraid, but we were also afraid. I would say that when the project started, with the first invitation, it was
the project for Visible Collectives.
Yeah, the first museum project was Queen's Museum. So we had been doing things, but the first time we physically showed in a museum was the Queen's Museum show Fatal Love, curated by Jayashree Avachandani and Prerna Reddy. And it was the first kind of South Asian American collective show of that kind at Queen's Museum. I think when we started, it was quite specific, right? You'll make a work about all these laws because you want people to learn about these laws and go back out and I don't know what, somehow do something, take action. Very, very amorphous, but somewhere in our head. Then you do the exhibition and you start spending all that time in the museum and you start to understand pretty quickly that that's not how it's going to work, right? People aren't going to, and you wouldn't want it either necessarily. People aren't going to sit there and take a note about every law you've made a work about or the names of everybody and then go out and write to their congressman. That's not the museum experience. Not necessarily. Lots of people, of course, have done works that result in that, but we weren't able to, right? And so then I think we gradually started coming into this idea, and I think it was definitely after the fact justification even of what was happening because it wasn't happening the way we wanted. So we really came up with this, the butterfly wing, the butterfly wing flapping and, thousands of miles away, an unexpected event will happen. So the idea that you're going to gradually seep into people's consciousness. And it's not going to manifest in the way you think. They're not perhaps going to call up their congressman, but it will manifest in some conversation they have.
The doubt or the beginning of other questions that might arise.
But even as we said that, we also there's this whole thing of okay, so maybe it'll show up in a dinner conversation and somewhere somewhere in Manhattan, Upper East Side, sorry to pick on the Upper East Side, but somewhere on the Upper East Side will be some dinner conversation where an explosion will happen because conventional wisdom will be broken. But then you think, but is that dinner conversation going to, I think there was a real back and forth push-pull between wanting something we could measure.
Exactly.
And you can't actually, there's no, you just have to accept that whatever happens, whatever subliminal, you're actually never going to know.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to accept it as well, perhaps. I mean, these days there are artists who have come up with like sort of, Hans Szakacs is a great example. He does a project, there's actually a questionnaire that people reply to, and if 100 people reply, a completely different chart gets produced. Okay, that's a very, very specific example. I guess gave the most extreme example possible of call and response using a computer inside a museum. And there are, of course, many other projects that do that sort of like measurable.
Way in, yeah.
But most of the time, you have to accept that you'll not know where it's gone. And you have to accept that as well.
And wrestle with that tension. I have so many more questions, but I want to leave room for our audience. And I think some of the point of discussion we want to bring in will be addressed to their questions. So I'm really excited about that. We'll go with our first questions which come from our Lunder Institute distinguished artist, Theaster Gates. We'll bring you into the screen, Theaster. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, Theaster.
Hey, how are you, Naeem?
Good, good. Nice to see you.
You too, man. I wanted to first just say thank you. This is a really wonderful dialogue between you and Daisy. And the question that I've had, you've actually touched on it in a few ways, but I thought I'd try to frame it to be even more focused. There are times when the collective seems like it has artists in it, and then there are moments where it seems like the group grows and there are others involved, others that may identify as artists or as creatives, but not totally. Maybe other times just people who are interested in social justice. They care about their national identity. They care about their country. And so I wanted to maybe posit the question of, can you reflect a little more about the excitement, the tension, the value challenges between people who were doing this for aesthetic plus political decisions and others for which this was their life and livelihood, or they were responding to the death of a loved one. Like there's so many reasons that people join. And if you could just spend a little bit more time talking about the relationship between artists and non-artists in your collective project, that would be amazing.
Yeah, great question, Theaster. And actually, you've added in the layer of participants that I hadn't, in my relatively quick summary, talked about, because I talked about people who are formal members of the collective.
Yes.
But as you pointed out, when you talk about people might have lost loved ones, there were people involved in our project specifically because they had somebody who had been affected. That's a much, if I was trying to make a collective chart of that, that would be another 20 pages. And I think there was always a tension because, especially people who had a loved one in detention, they were focused on a very single issue. I have to get my son out, right?
Yeah.
From prison. And they came to us to bring it to our attention because they had heard we're working on it, and then we are doing something about that. The closest to a focus on individual cases was the Casual Fresh American Style, which focused on 6 cases. And out of those 6, actually, if I'm not mistaken, the photographs we had, I think only 2 of them are actual detainees. The remaining 4 are family members of detainees who posed in their proxy. And one who was a Palestinian journalist actually died since then. I think, there was definitely there were ways we couldn't fulfill everything because we actually didn't know, we didn't really understand, we were quite green, we didn't understand what we had signed up for. I think when you are working with these families, you have to be ready to sign up for a long-term thing. And I think that was always a little bit of a tension because we do the project travels to a few places, but it's still the same project. Same project getting recreated downtown and then going to Chicago and then finally to Sweden has this sort of logistics and just putting it together and can we pull it off aspect, which would fill our mind and time and keep us satisfied. But I think sometimes the family members felt like, oh, something new hasn't happened, right? Like, they perhaps thought of it as like a documentary film where the documentary filmmaker travels with them and it builds and builds and builds. And maybe the finale of the film is the person actually gets out. So I think there was, I mean, especially once it went to Europe, then it was sort of, they couldn't even see it. And we're talking 2004, 5, 6, 7, even the means of sharing things with people was so much less. So I think Theaster, you're asking partially, I'm sure, because of your own experiences. And I'm actually, didn't you work on a project where the playground, I'm not sure if you were involved in that, where the playground was kept permanently?
I think it's the Tamir Rise gazebo.
Yeah.
Right.
Gazebo.
Right.
Yeah. I remember reading about that and thinking how long that must have taken and the level of engagement. We were not set up for, nor did we manage to do that kind of engagement, because we just, you know, I think because we were also committed to the aesthetic form and figuring out new ways to represent, right? So are you going to blank things out or show it more or have hypervisible faces and text on top, or you completely disappear the people. So there was also a desire to come up with a new solution. Right.
That's right.
You know, the thing I showed, driving while black becomes flying while brown, because of the structure of how we were built. You know, we spent our time trying to figure out a solution for doing a piece. Yeah. But we didn't go down to Oregon and try to track down those 5 detainees who were in prison. Right. I mean, there was a side of it definitely that we were careful of law enforcement. We, you know, a couple of years later, I think when Laura Poitras and Trevor Paglen started doing their work and I started meeting them, I remember thinking and even saying definitely to Laura, well, you can probably do certain things that we can't because you're a citizen, right? Right. And Trevor himself said that his background also gave him some level of, you know, whether you have protection or not is a different thing, but feeling of, right? Yes. I think one of the ways we didn't interact as much with the spaces that we're supposed to go to is, you know, we didn't go into the law enforcement spaces, right? I think we kept it, and I'm saying this now, thinking about it, like if I went back to those people, they would say, oh yeah, you did that with my family, but my family didn't get released. So it's, you know, I mean, I think Theaster, from your experience, you've had to deal with complex situations where you have to stay there beyond the premiere of the project.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm definitely asking because I don't believe that there's a right or wrong, but within a project, having a sense of what the limits are based on that project, you know, so there are moments where you want to have advocacy, but the advocacy is maybe more narrowly temporal than other times where they might be durational. And so it's actually really beautiful to hear that, like, the collective had a lifespan, but in some ways the lifespan generated enough passion and conviction. People went on to do greater things. And so it's not that these things have to live forever, but in fact, you just have to have a sense of the lifespan of the project. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ms. Daisy.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll go next to one of our Colby students, Sam Scott, which I'm really excited to welcome. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Daisy. Naeem, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about being a conduit for voices, especially in early 2000s America. What was it like? You've been doing a lot of talking about the collective as a we, but personally for you, what was it like to assume that responsibility, to know that your art might be the only thing that gave a voice to you know, certain populations who weren't being treated wonderfully?
Yeah, that's putting it very mildly.
Right.
Yeah. I feel I mentioned this before. I always had this little bit of a head split because you know, the more you worked on it, the more you realized that, you know, we had our fears, but we realized that we had actually, the more visible we became, no pun intended, as we started having more shows, the more we felt safe, because we thought, okay, we can say more and we can do more things and kind of be, so, you know, you're being the voice. There literally was one piece where it was a recording of everybody's voice, but it's anonymized. You don't want to be identified. And on the one hand, okay, you're giving the platform and actually the literal audio. You know, in the 2 videos I show, interestingly enough, the first man, he doesn't ever show his face. The second person is quite happy to show his face. He's also a US citizen. His wife is Latinx. And so I think there was sort of a shocked, but I'm American, why is this happening to me? So he wanted to be on camera, you know, and you know, he didn't necessarily need somebody else to be his voice, but there were these degrees where some other people, of course, didn't feel safe doing it. But, you know, it's when you're the only people in front, when however many collective members come, even though it's other people's voice, people did project it onto us, right? Especially since we are visibly migrants and, you know, not all of us, but some of us were also presumed Muslim from names or just from whichever country we're from. Although that presumption can also, of course, take you wrong, but generally people would guess that you're from the affected community. So like when Christopher Dan Bergman, he's a Swedish photographer, he did those big gap ad riff things. If he and I went somewhere together, if we were even somewhere together, there's a way that Christopher would kind of disappear because people wouldn't think of the Swedish guy as the face of the situation, and all the questions would come to me, and that was a problem. Like, wait, Christopher and I worked on this equally
together.
And then Aymara, being of Japanese heritage, would sort of confuse people, and then she would make a point of saying, well, the Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II, which could sometimes say to people, okay, that's why you're involved. So there was also, you're a conduit, but then you're like a blank slate onto which these stories are being projected. And I always feel, especially in the American condition, class isn't talked about, right? If you've gotten a college degree and come to New York with a job, you're in a completely different situation from the taxi driver, right? Who can be stopped at a moment's notice and whose papers will always be out of order. And we felt that would disappear a little bit. And I'm always into bringing it back in. So it was. I think some of us also struggle with the documentary form as a result. I started making more fictional. Personally, I started making more fictional projects partially because I've made many more documentaries since, and this sort of the burden, not the responsibility, is quite a lot. And I think maybe the other thing that I could have said, connecting this question to Theaster's question, is the means of distribution that we live within doesn't give us enough time to keep going with an ongoing relationship with someone, even if you want to, right? The project finishes and you're already working on the next project because that's the way it works. Or that's the way so far that we've thought. So I think it's actually, I don't know if documentary filmmakers or other people, maybe the closest example is people who have done PhDs and then published books 4 years later. The duration of like 10 plus years of one subject is maybe enough to make you go a little bit loopy, but at the same time, it's 10 years with one subject and maybe 10 years with the same 10, 15 people or communities or whatever. So that's a continuity that we don't generally have in our space. So that makes being the conduit for voices challenging.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Naeem. We'll go next to Julian Gillen, who's actually the Colby Museum Deputy Director. So here's an introduction between the two of you.
Hi, Julian. Nice to meet you on camera.
Likewise. Thank you for being with us. As Theaster said, I think, I typed my question out a while ago, and I think you've picked up on a lot of threads of it already, but the thing that got me thinking was the kind of tension in all that you were sharing with us and presenting to us about the kind of tension between the individual and the collective, and thinking about, in this moment, what are the things that are informing those divides? The way that we are all, the atomized time that you were talking about. And so maybe the refinement of my question, really, I was getting in a long-winded way to the question of what are the particular opportunities in this moment that are new or different for collective action by artists or by other groups, right? Maybe the refinement of that question is, we're no longer kind of all living together and consuming and paying attention in the analog ways that we used to. So what are the new challenges and opportunities for collective work in this moment?
Right. I think it's useful perhaps to, again, return to group material and think of group material in the 80s, Visible Collective in the 2000s, and the current moment where new collectives are being born, where I expect to be more an audience learning from them. One of the things that Doug and I were struck by is that group material was able to exist as an outsider gesture and form for quite a while, right? Before the institutional art world started noticing, this is critique of us, but we can actually. So there was a long time that they were able to stay not in the shadows, but in their own, as we sometimes used to say about the South Asian art scene in New York, when we were just ignored and left to our own devices, so you could kind of do whatever you wanted. With us, and that's one of the reasons why Doug's a friend, but one of the reasons we made that book is we wanted this conversation. We feel that the collective form as something of interest to programmers happened very quickly for us. We actually got programmed into an exhibition at Yerba Buena Center for Art in San Francisco. That was their second part of a series that they've done explicitly looking at collectives. So they did a first part with 3 collectives, then a second one with us. And we were happy to be there, and it was like with great groups like Red 76 and Temporary Services from Chicago. That was our cohort. Those are all, friends and allies, and we're great to be with them. But I was also like, wait, there's already a thing called shows about collectives. Yeah. And we've only been a collective for, so what does this mean? But it felt strange that what we had just done as an ad hoc sort of thing, and certainly thought of as a way to not be about individual, was already. And then of course the invitation comes to an individual. So an individual comes forward. I mean, that happens with group material as well. And any other collective. I think, from what I see of collectives now, I've seen, especially some collectives that have come out of, maybe I've seen a few that have come out of Cooper Union, other downtown New York configurations. Some of these collectives, and I'm going out on a limb trying to read into it, have already a savvy sense of the eye of the media and the eye of the institution, the EYE, and they already build in a critique within that. So even if the museum or the institution tries to appropriate them, they've already, maybe it's by the use of the ironic language, maybe it's sort of like a reflecting Hall of Mirrors things. But I think maybe for us, the problem was that we had this idea of the collective as this sort of pure, flat, everybody's doing the same thing and everybody's equally invested. And then kind of was like, wait, but it's a collective, but a few of us are going more often than others. Either because of course we, like Ibrahim and I, were of course more invested in this space, but also maybe we were available because we didn't have, like, some of our members of course had jobs. And then some people just didn't want to go to Sweden and go install because that wasn't the skill they were trying to learn or the world that we inhabit. So, I'm excited to see what collectives get up to now. But whenever I've seen new collectives, sometimes I've seen them in like the Whitney Biennial or Greater New York and just been like, this is something else that's actually, this won't be appropriated in the same way. Like it'll maintain its edge both as what a collective can do in terms of a work projected onto a world and what a collective can do through the members of the group. Having said that, of course, this is, I'm not sure how long, none of us know how long this is going to last, but let's say worst case scenario goes into early next year. We'll have had a year and a half of experiencing the world where we're working with everyone on the device. So that's changing things as well. And, fundamentally, even when I'm in a meeting, or even when I've gone to a birthday party with friends on Zoom, I've thought, but in real birthday parties, we don't all look at each other, right? And everybody's here on the grid, so we're all looking at each other as well as looking at ourselves. So our behavior is changing. So I'm wondering what collective organizing means when, everybody's organizing through this device.
Thank you, Julian. It surely is a question that we'll keep asking ourselves, and this series is actually one version of that. Like, how do we keep working collaboratively also as we want to, share opportunity and build together? So a question to be continued. We'll go next to actually our new museum director, Jackie Terrassa. Hi, Jackie. Oops, we can't hear you. Oops.
It's great to meet you and nice to see those of you on the screen. It's just been a great conversation. I am interested in the question of, given where all of you were coming from in terms of different practices in the first place, that you are not in fact coming from within the art world, what did the art world and specifically art museums offer you that perhaps other kinds of spaces didn't offer you? I'm just wondering what the value of art museums and the art world in particular.
So one thing I had referred to already, which is the possibility of getting an audience that you don't know at all. Because certainly in terms of meetings that we would go to, some of the organizations that were very active back then, some of whom are not around anymore because of the real estate situation. Brecht Forum, that was an organizing space, which sadly is now departed. Taxi Workers Alliance, all of these places, Youth Solidarity Summer. We would go to these places to organize. We would do film screenings there. We would do, music programs. We would do things that in form could have ended up in the museum. because of the way those spaces work, it was always people we knew, because that's how you found out about it, right? It was beautiful. It was very collective in the other sense of a collective audience. You knew everyone there. You had the comfort. It felt more like your session of sharing with like-minded people. The museum definitely, even from the first show, Queen's Museum, gave us the possibility of reaching people that we just didn't know and were never going to meet. Queen's Museum in particular had this program. I think they were the first one of the first museums to have such a large educational initiative, and that came perhaps from not being in Manhattan. So they had this thing where they would bring public high school teachers there. And we did immediately, within 2 weeks of the show, get people saying, yes, but what are you saying? Are you glorifying these people? Immediately that question about why do you have pictures of people who've been detained? Surely they've done something wrong. And what was really bracing about it is nowhere in our affinity circles were we going to get that question. And sure, it's also a little bit scary to face that question and have to try to explain and go, oh my God, we're on 2 different planets. But at the same time, but this is the people who believe that what's happening in the name of security is actually okay. We got that right away. Maybe we got that more because it was Queen's Museum rather than MoMA in Manhattan. So you really got people who wanted to use the museum as an educational space. And then we always felt like they would stumble onto the work and then be sort of I think today it won't seem so extraordinary because there's so much work that's critical of the current administration. There's so much work about security and surveillance. But 2004, there really wasn't much, right? It was really with the, rise maybe a year later with Mariam Ghani and Trevor Paglan and Laura Poitras that really a lot of work started coming out. So we also felt very lonely. The museum absolutely offered us the chance to reach people that we wouldn't reach otherwise. And then the other thing is that, it's a little easy if you use film as the metaphor because we didn't just have film, but film definitely in a museum has the possibility of people walking in, right, halfway through, have no idea what it is, didn't even bother reading the label, no need, go in. And either you're going to get somebody who's going to come out bored or disgusted or furious or some other emotion, but basically don't have time. Or you'll get somebody who'll get pulled in and maybe an hour later come out and say, wait, who was that, right? I think, especially in a group show setup, right? So we were in a group show the first time. So there were people there to see the beautiful painting and the gorgeous sculptures, and then they might happen to pick up the headphone. That's really what it did. Then later, of course, as it started continuing, then it became the aesthetic possibilities of, we are so limited by what is the public reaction to these photographs being released. Let's shred them as both a form of catharsis for us and to make a statement that almost don't matter. So that was a piece we did called It's Safe to Open Your Eyes Now, after shredding all. So we started also exploring what the forms would do for us in terms of how we're working through this material. So that came a little bit later as more shows started happening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Naeem. We have 2 more questions. I know we're a little over 7, but stay with us because they're a great question. Next one will go to James McDonald.
Daisy, it's Ian. I'm going to turn down my speaker. James's audio doesn't work.
Oh, okay. All done.
So he asked if we can read his questions for him.
Yes, with great pleasure. Thank you for your question, James, and your intervention, Ian. So James is asking, does tangible action alleviate the frustration of experiencing injustice?
Tangible action or tangible results?
Does tangible action alleviate the frustration of experiencing injustice?
Does it?
And maybe the results are part of that equation. I would keep that close.
I suppose first and foremost, it was a solution to a feeling of inertia, right? That nothing you're doing, just sort of the feeling that nothing you're doing matters. So let's go into this other domain. I don't know if I thought about it in terms of whether it alleviates something for us. I'm sure, of course it did.
Or if some of you, if I'm rereading James' question, if some of you as part of the collective were experiencing injustice in these moments, does being in action together maybe alleviate some of that frustration?
For sure, and some of our members were experiencing it more, depending on where they were living, or they were experiencing their family members were experiencing it. So there was definitely that. I suppose, I have a strange. Of course, I experienced it, but I was also here. I came to America alone. My parents still live in Bangladesh, so there's a strange thing when your family is not here. You don't feel your parents are vulnerable. I'm sure for a lot of people, their parents.
It's a family affair. Yeah.
So definitely there was probably, I'm sure there was, I suppose if I asked anyone directly, the answer that anyone would give is like, thank God I'm doing something, not just sitting here. Right? And I think the museum as a space definitely came after we had tried the more conventional things, right? Where we thought, okay, we write a newspaper editorial and you do this, you produce this report and you take photographs and you do documentary journalism. Put down the record in the conventional organs. And I think I'm trying to think why those things didn't give us relief. I think actually, to be frank, the reason it didn't give us relief, it seems very hard to think of it now, is there was so little of it available. Right? I actually, I'm so critical, or we can all be so critical of the museum in many ways today in terms of what it hasn't done for us yet. But I can freely say that in 2004, it was the space that was open to us. Other spaces weren't even, so it wasn't as if we were thinking, oh, we could publish a New York Times editorial or we could do a 5-minute film for a museum. It's actually the museum was the only space that were allowed. And also, this is a huge blessing. The museum didn't intervene in any of the work.
No.
They never said, we weren't the only one. There were other people who were making work in the same exhibition because it was American and Canadian artists. So also what was going on in Canada. Museum, the curators never said, oh, you have to change this.
We should just that, not at all. There was an open platform and lots of freedom.
Yeah, like I think this many years later, I'll have accumulated so many complaints about the museum that I might forget that there was also that, and I shouldn't.
That time,
and actually that's still there. There's still, we can have critique of the museum, but even the last Whitney Biennial with all of its criticisms, there was work. There was the forensic architecture work inside the show that critiqued the museum trustee. That's a big thing for a museum to allow. I'm sure forensic architecture also played a big role in insisting, but that still happens, and there can be a mode of cynicism about that, but I think it's also worth celebrating.
Well, thank you, James, for your question. I'm sorry we couldn't hear your voice, but thank you for offering us a question. And we'll go to our last question of the evening by John. John, I'm so sorry. I fear I'm going to mispronounce your last name. John Shamgoyan. I'll ask John, but please join us.
Shamgoshan.
I'm so sorry. Hi.
No worries. So I'm working on an anthropology honors thesis this semester and school year about international students at Colby and how they've responded to current events. And I've wanted to incorporate kind of visual photography into my work. And I'm curious if I want to hear any advice you have, because it would be really appreciated. And more than that, I'm interested in, I know that you have an anthropological background. I'm interested in how you broke from that traditional ethnographic approach, the written ethnography, and why. I'm basically asking why you've chosen the medium or media that you have as your vehicle of meaning.
I still had to do a traditional anthropology thesis. I didn't get to submit it might appear that way, or I might sometimes even write my biography that way. I had to do a very traditional 7-year written thing, but the films were alongside. Were the international students able to come back to Colby? Are they actually there?
Yes.
Right. Oh, because Colby is from the New York perspective, no school here is having in-person classes. So for a lot of the international students, there was no point in coming. I think it would be fantastic to get the students involved in collecting artifacts for you, right? As opposed to you just going there and photographing something in their spaces. What if they, I have to imagine, it's actually interesting, really, this is like a New York thing. All the international students I know are still where they are. So they are mainly dealing with time zone difference, taking classes at 1 a.m. to catch the American afternoon or morning. But you have students actually there. So I have to imagine that just thinking about my own situation, one of the largest aspects of their experience has to be staying in touch with family and being constantly worried, depending on which country they're from and the healthcare system, right? So, in New York City, I do go out, but almost every other day. I call up my parents and basically say, don't go out anywhere, right? So in Bangladesh. So if they have that kind of relationship with their family members, they are also maybe having an inversion where instead of being the child, I'm not saying this is the case, but could be, they're becoming the caretaker. I mean, I know with my parents, I now treat them as I need to take care of them. I need to find scientific information and tell them that this is the right mask to wear, and this is why washing fruit with vinegar doesn't work. So it's an inversion of the caretaking role. So if they're going through that kind of thing, I have to imagine there's a little bit of that. I mean, I'm sure their parents are worried about them as well, but they're also in Maine, so maybe not the same fear as somebody in New York City. It might be interesting to figure out what are the artifacts of that relationship, right? I mean, maybe nobody's mailing anything to each other anymore, but what are they exchanging? Is everything on Zoom? Is the only form of affection and caring digital affirmation? My mother actually likes to talk with audio, not video, because she hates the headphones and she doesn't want to hold it like this because then she can see herself. And she says, no, I don't want to see myself. So we do audio. So that's my mother saying, I don't want this technology, all this video. And she actually has actively said, no, Zoom, we're not going to do Zoom. So these things must be happening to your classmates, right? And you've got, I don't know what the cross section is, what countries and how many. I don't know how that works, but that's another aspect. If you have international students from France or Sweden, that's one aspect. If you have from India, or China, or Nigeria, that's a whole other aspect. And each is different also, right? So there might be a lot to look at there. You might have to become an expert on what's happening in each of those countries as well. The Johns Hopkins, it's a bit morbid, but the Johns Hopkins mortality index, the dashboard that they do, which shows all countries, and the countries keep changing. In fact, it's kind of fascinating amount of data to see which countries go up and which countries go down. The US is still at the top, of course, but I just want to say, this is from an anthropology point of view. The other interesting thing is, New York was the epicenter. It's now gone down, but New York was the epicenter in March, April. And I really was, it was a new experience for me to have people from Bangladesh, my parents, my friends, calling and saying, are you okay? Right? Like worried about me over here because the pandemic hadn't arrived there. So even a sort of like, oh, we are okay. It must be because of our diet. It must be because we have so much turmeric. It must be because the warm weather kills this is what people were saying in Bangladesh. Or it must be because of tuberculosis inoculation, which we all get when we were kids. 2 months later, the wave came there. And then it turned out none of that was true. None of that actually protected you. Certainly not turmeric. And then it shifted where suddenly I was the one who was calling and saying, are you okay? And there was no more space to say, how are you doing? How are, not you, but all of you doing in New York? So this is a strange 2-month period where people were in countries that are used to looking at the United States as some sort of, they might think of it as a hegemonic force, but they'll also think of it as a wealthy country with a lot of infrastructure, where suddenly they were, worrying about another country is a strange form of caring that can also go against your politics. You might consider the US to a hegemonic force, but of course, when you're seeing photographs of individuals getting sick, you'll have a whole other reaction. So that was a very interesting turn. I think that's something that could be rich material for thinking through anthropology. What are the imagined communities that people are building, right?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for your question. It's great to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Good luck with that final project.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Keep me posted.
Please do. Naeem, I want to thank you so much for the generosity of your presence. This has been such a great first conversation. And as this is coming to an end, I want to say again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a generous host and making all the space for all this. Thank you.
To be continued, because before I let everyone go, I want to remind you all that this series will continue during the fall semester. The next conversation will be on October 15 with Anquilis Thomas and Eric Gottsman, and it will be conducted by my colleague Tanya Sheehan, Director of Research at the Lunder Institute, who also stewarded this series with me, and who I want to thank so dearly for her help tonight. Thank you, Tanya. And finally, on November 12th, one of our other senior fellow, the scholar Romy Crawford from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, will be in conversation with our distinguished artist, Theaster Gates. So please join us. Special thanks to the Lunder Institute team for their precious support in making this happen, as well as the Colby Museum. Thank you to the Colby IT department, Arlene, Ian. Thank you so much for being such patient collaborator. And finally, we are always so grateful to Peter and Paula Lunder, without whom none of our work could be possible. More soon. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you again, Naeem. Stay safe, and more soon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.